Today's topic is World Slump, the financial crisis and emerging class struggles in the global south. Thank you, Adam, for that nicely discussion of the scorched earth policies from the deleveraging of the capitalist classes and the green shoots coming from a totally different direction. We'll turn it over to Patrick now to speak on the financial crisis, and particularly raising some of the issues in Africa. Patrick?
Ooh, that was formidable, and I don't think I can speak quite as fast. I can try, but you've done so much to set the context, Adam. The long-term global overaccumulation crisis, maybe one or two of you will disagree with me here, but I'll take the point that crisis resolution isn't happening, it's crisis displacement. Certainly a financial bubble bursting, a devalorization of overaccumulated finance. Half of the equity, stock market values disappearing in late 2008. But I agree, destruction of real capital still on the agenda, further and deeper attacks on workers and the poor, social political repression. Ideologically, probably a period where the neoliberal project will be revitalized through austerity regimes, momentary Keynesianism turning out only to be financial crony capitalism. So let's just see where in Africa the financial squeeze, the trade problems, the commodity bubble bursting is going to potentially be amplified now in the coming period through the recapitalization and re-legitimization of the International Monetary Fund. That, to me, represents one of the main sites of our own, particularly here in Toronto, and comrades I'll be seeing in the US next week, fighting for some sort of lifting of the boot from Africa's neck. It is a profound problem when Africa was pushed onto an export-led, extractive-based accumulation strategy, accumulation for especially the London and Australian mining houses, and then the Chinese minerals extractors, with now petroleum, minerals, cash crops down between 40 and 70%. South Africa's stock market down 40%. In trade, the Baltic Dry Index is an indicator of trade activity down at 1.94%. It's come up a bit, not only due to demand, but also the credit crisis and the lack of bills of exchange. Foreign direct investment crashing. Disinvestment even worse now by the Chinese, who'd come in on a fly-by-night basis, setting up minerals, smelting, and other extractive systems. Remittances way down. Aid flows from the north to the south down 8%, the Stockholm Institute just reported. Arms deals up by about the same. And now debt relief, we've just been learning from a new IMF report, which we thought in 2008 with some Jubilee activism had gotten rid of some essentially non-repayable debt which would never have been repaid. In fact, is accompanied by an increase in debt servicing. The IMF this year estimates that Africa's debt servicing goes from around 12 to 16% of export revenues. So, and that's before they take into account the decline in exports due to the crisis. So we really have seen an extraordinarily wicked squeezing, and worse yet, no change in IMF policy. Some of you might have heard Dominique Strauss-Kahn talking last October at the IMF annual meeting as the crisis began to unfold, and asking every country that could, please expand your budget 2%. We need a 2% Keynesian boost. It turns out for Africa, no chance, because even the strongest, richest economy, South Africa, was told the exact same week in the Article 4 consultation, the annual meetings in which the IMF staff come down and lay down the line, that South Africa would have to halt its move to deficit financing, which had just began a small Keynesian boost this year, and raise the interest rate. It has been falling because of economic crisis and strong political pressure, continue its financial and trade liberalization, and remove workers' wage indexing protections. So these are the sorts of things that in even the strongest country, the South African economy, the IMF's Africa team is maintaining its dogmatic austerity regime. Another example might be Tanzania. Did any of you notice that at a Brookings Institute talk in March, Dominique Strauss-Kahn offered to be Africa's representative to the G20. There were only one African team, South Africa, going to that meeting. And of course, to get the sort of mandate, Dominique Strauss-Kahn gathered some friendly heads of state in Tanzania in March At the same time, he was trying this gambit, and unfortunately succeeding, given how sort of prone the African elites are to compradorизation. His own staff was telling the Tanzanian government to cut its budget deficit by 0.6%, so plenty of doctors and nurses and community health workers and teachers fired at the same time. So all of this just again shows the sort of northern hypocrisy on the sort of Keynesian moment accompanied by austerity. So we're seeing some of these then reflected also last week when Barack Obama in the United States, thanks to Trevor Manuel, the South African finance minister, the G20 meeting recapitalized the IMF. It'll probably be over $1 trillion, 500 billion in cash, more special drawing rights. So this is a really dangerous time. I thought it was quite telling that Barack Obama united several of his major projects, the expansion of the war in Afghanistan and more funding of the Iraq occupation, with a $100 billion IMF. Now, he nearly lost because a few left-wing Democrats united with Republicans. He did win, but it does just suggest that we have a really serious problem there. As for I mentioned the IMF now, the World Bank, it's expecting a revitalization, working over the last 2 or 3 years, to be based upon greening the bank, and especially taking charge of perhaps the last hope that global capital has for a new bubble, namely the air, the privatization of the air, carbon trading. And that would be, as I did a little brief discussion and talk here last year, to expand the Kyoto Protocol's carbon trading gimmickry in Copenhagen. And it turns out on Friday, the Waxman-Markey bill in the US House of Representatives was passed. You might remember that Obama was campaigning against John McCain in the 2008 presidential election because they had a substantial difference in both of their commitments to carbon trading. For Barack Obama, and the desire to raise lots and lots of money to invest in green jobs and renewable energy and new public transport and all the rest, they would be selling the right to pollute, selling the carbon credits. Instead of selling them, now 85% of those credits will be given away to reward the polluters already there. And on top of that, there are all these provisions for offsets. Offsets are the indulgences, as you know, allowing you to pollute and pay to keep polluting. And as a result, according to some of the people that are really researching this rigorously, it's not going to be until 2030 that the United States actually begins its first reductions in CO2 emissions. And James Hansen, the famous climate expert, the NASA scientist who was arrested last week in a West Virginia coal blockade, he says that's actually better if that bill doesn't pass when it comes to Senate now. So obviously we need to do something drastic about the way in which the neoliberal project has taken, in a sense, the climate challenge and privatized the air and commodified. I would just remark here that I've spent the last couple of days with the World Council of Churches in extraordinary discussions on the ecological debt concept, and actually it comes from progressive, a radical eco-social justice movement in Quito, Ecuador, Acción Ecológica, and in fact we have a representative of Acción Ecológica here, and I hope we'll all get to learn this concept of ecological debt and begin to do not just calculations, but the moral and the political organizing that would make for now an increasingly obvious excuse for third world countries to repudiate their financial debt on the basis that they are in fact owed by the North vast amounts of ecological debt. This is one example of that repudiation process, the Ecuadorian government with the radicals in civil society saying, look, we should audit the inherited odious debt, the historic debts that are keeping the country down, and with pressure, Rafael Correa, the president, did begin that default process, and lots more pressure on third world countries needed. But those are the kinds of alternatives, at least at the level of climate. Would elites reform their system in Copenhagen in December? Probably not. It'll probably be an expansion of the worst aspects of the Kyoto Protocol. Hence, maybe we should be hoping, I think it's fairly openly said now, that Copenhagen could go the way of Seattle a decade earlier. There is some talk that instead of blocking the negotiators to prevent them from going inside to do a bad deal, maybe they should be blocked to stay inside until they do a good deal. But the balance of forces being what they are, I'm not sure that particular tactic will work. So you'll, I hope, follow that and be part of the discussions. Instead, the best hope for elite reform seems to have been played out in the last couple of days in New York. That's the Joe Stiglitz Commission on Financial Reform. Now, Miguel Descoto Brockman, the Nicaraguan diplomat, who's certainly the most progressive UN president in the General Assembly president in history, remarked to an NGO gathering about 10 days ago that the member states, particularly those in the north, increasingly resist reforms of the IMF and World Bank, hoping that things will return to business as usual. And they've made it very clear they do not want a serious global conversation to take place at the UN. So Descoto is really signaling to everyone, don't expect anything out of what has just happened. I haven't actually followed whether anything did come out of this big UN conference on financial reform. But what was going in was pretty bad. So I'll just give you a sense of how even social democratic post-Washington reformers have failed with analytical nerve, failed with political gumption. Stiglitz had in 2002 called for the replacement of the IMF. Now he's calling for its re-legitimization and recapitalization. What about capital and exchange controls, which Stiglitz has in the past endorsed? A Tobin tax to deter financial speculation? You won't find that in the Stiglitz Commission. What about converting all these bank nationalizations from lemon socialism into, as Leo's argued so eloquently, a genuine public utility? That's not there. Debt cancellation, odious debt, reparations, ecological debt, not there. Detailed strategies for the financing implications for the climate crisis, not there. The unregulated top money centers, the need for commodity price regulation, not there. So this is just a little catalog of where the elites have these major problems that anyone can see represents a profound threat to the integrity of the capitalist system, but they can't even put them on the table for discussion, even in the most center-left possibilities. I think this reflects something we really have to come to grips with, which is that at the global scale, reforming economic, political, geopolitical, and ecological challenges that really do represent threats to humankind is just not happening. When was the last time you can all reflect upon a serious global scale reform? Perhaps the 1996 Montreal Protocol banning chlorofluorocarbons, maybe some toxic bans, but basically we've looked at the United Nations Development Program joining the water privatization bandwagon, hence in 2002 at the World Summit on Sustainable Development, a massive protest in Johannesburg of 30,000, the 2001 World Conference Against Racism refusing to put Zionism and the reparations for slavery and colonialism and apartheid on the agenda, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which gave us the carbon trading gimmickry. We failed to see any reform of the IMF, the World Bank, any reform of the WTO, any ability to get the Doha agenda started. We've seen gimmicks like the Millennium Development Goals suck in well-meaning NGOs and progressive intellectuals, but really nothing has come of the global scale. So now I can just take another 6-7 minutes, say, have lots of time. Okay, we've got some national projects that are quite exciting, especially in the South, and we've got some very exciting local, and I can speak from some of the sites of struggle in South Africa. That will just be my wrap-up here. So the big demands, of course, sort of a socialist revolution, the defaulting on the foreign debt, imposition of exchange controls to get control of the finances required to reindustrialize and redevelop in an environmentally coherent way, and nationalizing and re-regulating banks. Dramatically increasing state spending for social programs, especially those benefiting women, and as much as possible aimed at spurring production so as not to generate inflation, and turning to an ecologically sustainable, labor-intensive system of production, creating genuine green jobs and moving economics to a post-carbon future. I think everyone here would unite with those transitional demands, or let's say feasible sorts of goals. I mean, Argentina, for example, defaulted in 2002. It was crucial for its recovery. Malaysia in 1998 imposed exchange controls, which was critical for it becoming the most successful exit country from the 1998 crisis. South Korea remains the model for nationalizing banks to generate a more balanced industrialization, or at least an industrialization with state values and objectives. Scandinavia on social policy, Cuba turning to renewable energy. The kinds of things I've mentioned are entirely feasible, except for the balance of forces under existing capitalism. Well, let's look at where some of the contemporary strategies inspire us from, especially Latin America. As I mentioned, Korea's default on odious debt, the Argentine debt default in 2002, where they did end up buying some back, but it was a greatly reduced discounts. Ecuadorian and Bolivian rejection of Bretton Woods personnel in their countries, the Venezuelan imposition of capital controls, and the initiation of the Bank of the South idea is still under contestation. Lots of money for more creative community banking strategies that aren't based on financial returns, but social and environmental returns. The call by the Venezuelan government for the World Bank and IMF to be closed. And then we have the strategies that from the critical forces like Acción Ecológica, keeping the oil in the soil, in the Yasuni Park now seems, as of last week, with German financing to be actually imminent, and more impressive links that are being forged between civil society groups at the World Social Forum with the Latin American leftist leaders. There is, of course, awful news this morning. The Honduran government apparently overthrown, although the president is safe in Costa Rica. Well, let's just say that these Latin American national strategies from South Africa look very impressive because our national elites across the continent haven't got the guts to do anything as cheeky as that. So we'll turn finally for some inspiration to the situation in South Africa, where the same kind of story about the crisis that we've just been hearing from Adam is playing out. Dramatic job losses, the state's failure to keep wage promises, public transport restructuring, huge electricity price increases are some of the flashpoints. First quarter of 2009, we had a 6.4% GDP crash, the worst since the kind of apartheid siege economy. Rise in unemployment is above 25%, rising inequality. So let's look at some hopeful signs. Community protests are up. Now we have about 8,000 a year, the police measure. Some say that's half as many as really happened. We think that's the highest in the world. Damn it, the Chinese, I think, have just taken the lead. 58,000 recorded in the first quarter of 2009. So per person, I think they've just gotten ahead. So our team will have to be more competitive. Anyway, we'll see. They are actually in all sorts of ways. Every morning I do a scan of the newspapers and collect the most exciting community protests. Anyone that wants that, just let me know. The labor struggles are extraordinary. Like right now, the doctors in the public sector are shutting down the health system, and they're probably going to expand their strike next week because they're not being paid enough. Municipal workers. I mean, I've seen you've got very polite municipal workers here. In Toronto, who don't pick up the rubbish, but they let the rubbish bins stand unattended, upright. That's not what our team does. They knock those over. They make it very clear to all and sundry that there's a rubbish workers, municipal workers strike on. The class struggle is extraordinary, and it's being played out a little bit because of a rumbling confidence on the ground that's matched by the elites and the labor movement having made some extraordinary gains. There's no denying that the African National Congress government, after a long period of severe neoliberalism, conjoined, by the way, with a sort of extraordinary Brezhnevite Marxism, as Raymond Settner calls it. I just was in Moscow and with one of the handlers of Thabo Mbeki when he was in exile. It was really interesting to see. Mbeki tossed out, notwithstanding a last gasp effort to bring Hugo Chavez in to shore up his left-wing credentials last September. And now replaced by a man, Jacob Zuma, who has very dubious qualities in all sorts of ways. Without going into them, nevertheless, what the labor movement and the Communist Party have done is inject a few of their cadres into top positions, but also push so hard that we actually have a possibility, I think a very strong possibility, of getting a national health insurance established this year against dramatic and sort of paranoid propaganda coming now from the insurance companies. It's about roughly 8 billion Canadian dollars annual economic activity now at stake there. Macroeconomic policy is also under great contestation. I'll give you a couple of the examples of that. The South African Finance Minister, Trevor Manuel, who was responsible for this recapitalization, running a commission for the IMF for the G20 in April, that gave them over $1 trillion, it seems, in new power. Well, back at home, he was removed from the finance ministry and made head of a new economic planning commission. Some say he's a prime minister, but the labor movement says, no, we've disempowered him. So it remains to be seen exactly the state of play. However, a couple of weeks ago at the World Economic Forum's meeting in Cape Town, Trevor Manuel said, quote, when anybody in the trade unions open their mouth, the corporations run like hell. That's pretty exciting to hear from the former finance minister. There's no counterweight in society. If there's no counterweight, you can't have outcomes that advance and progress. If we're going to have cowards in business, we're not going to get very far. Trevor Manuel speaking to the World Economic Forum, trying to, encourage them to be more militant against labor. Disgusting, replied the National Union of Metalworkers spokesperson, Alex Mishila. If Mr. Manuel's utterances reflect the view and the role of the national democratic state in relation to class struggle between labor and capital, the future of the working class and the poor is doomed. And this is part of an extraordinary moment where, and I hear, the NUMSA folks have had Leo and Sam come and give them the sort of strategic insights into understanding corporate globalization. There was a period, unfortunately, when NUMSA had a rather pro-Mbeki leadership. And the metalworkers now have become one of the most militant unions. The most militant really still remain the public sector. But they've been saying, for example, amassing protests, 2,000 at a time, when the central banker, Tito Mboweni, has his monetary policy committee meetings, and demanding that the interest rate be cut further and further. And actually, that kind of pressure seems to be succeeding. I happened to spend a morning with the central bank governor, Mboweni, and the NUMSA activists, and they were extraordinarily cheeky and brave and bold in making their demands, and they'll keep going back as Mboweni fails to bring the interest rate down quickly enough. In their last Congress, about 6 weeks ago, NUMSA demanded that companies threatened with closure and still viable should be taken over by government or be assisted to form cooperatives. Key sectors producing strategic raw materials, steel, oil, should be considered for nationalization. NUMSA must lead in the creation of green jobs and campaign for funding for cleaner vehicles. I'll conclude with two areas where, from rhetoric to reality, we've seen this militancy and class struggle, I think in the same spirit we've been talking, which is to de-commodify and de-globalize where commodification and globalization represent austerity or failure to achieve services. So just to conclude, to give us the maximum hope, we'll look to the water and AIDS medicine struggles. Water privatization really has been rolled back, and just a quick update on that, because when I was here teaching 5 years ago, we had quite a few wonderful opportunities for South African activists to come through. So you all know the story of how after Suez, a big French company, came into Johannesburg in 2001, Soweto was in flames. And you had Canadian activists, Maud Barlow, Tony Clark coming through regularly, Naomi Klein writing about it. So you know the story. Well, in fact, it isn't just in the streets and in reconnecting illegally that the activists were able to push Suez, effectively push them out of Johannesburg in 2006. Their contract was not renewed. Suez left behind, however, their policies and their machinery. The machines include the prepayment meters, where you have to pay first before you get your water. So the activists not only would do a bypass and allow these prepayment meters to become, they're called statues, because they just sit there in your garden, but underneath the water is flowing through illegally reconnected pipes. And similar strategy for electricity. But in addition to sort of an autonomous direct action, which is organized by a Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee and Anti-Privatization Forum, the Coalition Against Water Privatization, some of the activists also went to the courts, and last year they achieved an extraordinary victory by making the prepayment meters actually illegal and by doubling the free water allocation. That was rolled back a little bit in February in one of the appeal courts, but in September we're hoping for an even greater expansion of the right to water through the courts, but really codifying what activists have taken anyway. And that brings us to the final case for hope, which is where if we talked 10 years ago in this room about the worst threat to the health and to the mortality rate of Africans, it would be AIDS. And we could tell, $15,000 a year medicines, we could do something, but $15,000 a year wasn't available to many Africans, maybe half of 1%. So what we needed to do there was to develop a global campaign led by the activists of the South, supported by Brazilian government, Indian government, Thai government, with unity from Médecins Sans Frontières, ACT UP in the US, I'm sure some of you in Toronto. And what was accomplished is unbelievable. Not only did Al Gore running for president in 1999, 2000, Bill Clinton at Seattle in 1999, were they pushed into repudiating the intellectual property rights of big pharmaceutical companies, which was extraordinary because their whole agenda has been taking intellectual property rights and making them the absolute cornerstone of US accumulation at the world scale. But in addition, a genocidal government, I think that's the technical term to describe Thabo Mbeki's approach to HIV/AIDS. Those guys were pushed to give the medicines. And Big Pharma, which filed a lawsuit against the South African government in 2001, by massive pressure around the world, was forced to drop the lawsuit. So today, and starting in November 2003, 700,000 South Africans are HIV positive whose CD4 counts are low are now getting the free antiretroviral medicines, and several million in Africa. What they've done, in addition to not only getting the medicines, but producing them on a generic basis, not a branded basis, gives you a sense that that principle, a kind of Polanyian double movement, if you will, of decommodification when the commodity form goes way too far, to water privatization, into medicines, into the privatization of the air through carbon trading. We have people fighting back. And to deglobalize capital so that we can take control and produce the goods locally is part and parcel of that. Kicking Suez back to Paris, kicking the big pharmaceutical companies back to New Jersey and Switzerland, and hopefully kicking the carbon traders back to wherever they come from. And those are the kinds of things I believe that we should all be learning from in thinking about several decades now of resistance. IMF riots, big social movement gatherings from the 1990s, and then surgical campaigns, where we're still obviously needing to do much better linkage and connecting the dots to make this deglobalization, decommodification, destratification agenda a socialist agenda, is to find a broader political language. But I think if we're listening closely to these movements, some of them in South Africa, some of them forcing the Latin American governments to become more militant, we're going to be finding the way out of this crisis. Thanks, Hanieh.
Thank you, Adam, for that nicely discussion of the scorched earth policies. Characterize your argument. A very interesting discussion of kind of emergency neoliberalism versus neoliberalism underserved versus the deglobalization project. Sweeping discussion. These presentations have been very broad-ranging, with literally taking the topic's title seriously on world slump and the financial crisis and emerging class struggles. So we have a wide range of things to discuss, and the floor is open. We'll take half a dozen interventions, and then turn it back to Patrick and Adam to respond. So the floor is open for comments, questions.
Focus on a couple of the perspectives from South Africa, because now you're getting to really good socio-cultural and political problems, which that's not my specialty. I'm a kind of political economist, political ecologist. However, Herman and John are wondering whether the rise of Jacob Zuma and not only, can I say, a sort of revived African nationalism, less paranoid and explicitly neoliberal than Thabo Mbeki's, but we haven't yet begun to see this real stresses emerge. And we did see those stresses in Jacob Zuma's personal behavior, particularly when he ran a trial defense against a rape charge and also against corruption charges. He wasn't very impressive. He was misogynist. His supporters were openly Zulu ethnicists, and there was an extraordinary fear that the rise of a apparently corrupt and bumbling and patriarchal character to the presidency of South Africa would indeed foretell a rise of an awful populism. We also saw last year xenophobia lead to the death of over 60 people and displacement of many tens of thousands. And in Durban we only had a couple of deaths, but having worked quite a lot with the activists, we still see strong residual traits of that tendency amongst workers and poor people who see immigrants from the region as a material threat. A communist trade and industry minister who is a real communist. His name is Rob Davies. He actually was trained in Marxist Kulansian theory at Sussex and hasn't really let it go. In fact, his appointment from deputy trade minister to trade minister has actually given us some hope that the South African sub-imperial posture in Africa, and especially trade-related imperialism, will actually begin to be contested. It's very complicated because right now the economic partnership agreements of the EU are the vehicle for imperialism into the region, and they're smashing with EU bilaterals the regional bodies, the South African Customs Union, the Eastern African COMESA, the Western Africa ECOWAS, are literally being taken to bits right now by the EU's trade negotiator. And that's not even Peter Mandelson, it's whoever I've forgotten the name, who's replaced Mandelson. So there's a very important struggle over trade. And Rob Davies has actually drawn the line and said we're not doing the EPAs. And in fact, if EPAs bring cheap manufactured goods into South Africa, we'll probably have to put up some barriers to, say, Namibia or Botswana being an export platform. So that's one of the sort of interesting moments where we'll see a nuance, but potentially very important reversals of South Africa's neoliberal trade approach. The other ministers that are interesting are Bladen Zamande, the General Secretary of the SACP, being the new Higher Education Minister. Those of us in universities await the promise of free education for the poor with great hope, because we certainly need to release the incredible pressure on the bills that these poor students are paying. We also have a Deputy Transport Minister, Jeremy Cronin, the main ideologue of the SACP, who has a huge job because he has to sort out the taxi wars, which I think absolutely cannot be sorted out under capitalism. So we'll see what can be done in that context. There are a few other left-leaning ministers. Certainly the health minister has come out very strongly for national health insurance, and the finance minister, who's replaced Trevor Manuel, his name's Pravin Gordhan, was a Communist Party theorist and now probably would say social democratic. So there is a little bit more space and free play for these protests to get concessions. And I think even as we see the doctors make big demands, 50% pay increases, I think they've already been offered 30%. We'll see if they're going to be satisfied in the next few days. That doesn't mean, however, that we're ready to declare the possibility of a genuine reindustrialization and a green reindustrialization. Could that be reversed in a new era in which a left government could come to power? Certainly that's the sense we'd get from Venezuela's strategy of reindustrialization that has been also driven by effective demand by poor and working people. And that would be the set of goals to have protectionism insofar as it protects a new approach to industrial policy. Is it impossible? Again, the 30s is a good period for us to think about, because if we've just seen in 2007, 2008, the 1929 to 31 financial bubbles bursting, the devalorization of finance, but if, I think as we're claiming, overaccumulated industrial capital, real capital, remains for devalorization, we could have a long period, a Great Depression of the 30s, early 40s.
Looking at like the rise of the Islamist movements, it's important to see it in the context of neoliberalism since the mid-80s and 1990s. That the space left by the destruction of the left in many of the key countries in the area was what enabled these groups to arise on one hand. But on the other hand, I think it's very important not to homogenize these groups. That, you know, I don't necessarily think a term like religious fundamentalism is the right way to actually describe many of the groups in the Middle East. That there's a very big difference between, for example, some of the reactionary regimes in the Gulf, like Saudi Arabia, etc., and the more popular movements, Hezbollah, Hamas. There is, even between them, there's a very wide range of differences. So it's important, I think, to look at the different social forces that support these different groups, and also to see, to what they are responding and what they are putting forward. In the case of, I mean, it's true that none of the Islamist movements are really putting any alternative to capitalism, and you can see that in the recent Lebanese elections. The Hezbollah's economic platform really didn't say very much. It was kind of saying, you know, we should do this, this, and this, but it didn't actually offer any concrete way of achieving some of their goals. You know, they would say we should alleviate poverty, but how you actually go about doing that, what are the mechanisms, there's no answer there. There's no answer in terms of how to... a lot of it is very kind of elite-driven ways of trying to solve economic questions, rather than seeing it in terms of mobilizing people and supporting social struggles. So it is true that none of these social forces offer any alternative to capitalism, But it is important to kind of see the differences between them and also see their role in the struggle against, struggle against Zionism and also anti-imperialist struggles at a regional level as well as part of it. I do think that in terms of how the regrowth of the left will centrally revolve around what happens in the case of Palestine. I'm talking about the Middle East here. That the regrowth of the strengthening of the left will depend on what happens around Palestine. And here, the final question asked around the relationship between global solidarity and local struggles, I think, is very pertinent. That what happens in Palestine will not be determined by what happens in Gaza and the West Bank. Palestinians are a diaspora population, refugee population across the Middle East as well as across the globe. The solidarity movements that have been built up, a lot of it inspired by the anti-apartheid struggles in South Africa, really are having a major impact on political struggles inside Palestine, internal Palestinian politics. So what the growth of the left, to me, the point of optimism that I tried to end on around the role of Palestine in this is that the growth of the left that I think we will see emerge in Palestine, because a left solution is the only real solution to the crisis, will depend on how the global movement interacts with the movements on the ground. And to my mind, there are very strong and positive indications of this. Of both. It's of one, the external impacting the internal and vice versa.
Adam speaking.
Okay, I think the preface is something I should have mentioned, which is that those of us on the independent left come with a certain renewed humility from roughly December 2007. That was a moment when Polokwane, the place where the African National Congress was held, where Thabo Mbeki was defeated in a vote to lead the ANC, and then 9 months later he was actually literally tossed right out as a president. And many of us on the independent left had assumed that the contradictions, this is in a way to pick up Jordan's point, within the capitalist state, it's a very neoliberal regime under Mbeki, and particularly pernicious and vicious. The tricks that Thabo Mbeki learned in Moscow were formidable. So it was hatred. But we thought that the configuration was such that the left would be kicked out, the center left would be kicked out of the alliance. And there's a lot more humility by myself and many others in realizing, wow, actually, as of like October, November, many of the most dynamic right-wing or center-right forces in the alliance were the ones that were actually kicked out and started a new party. Now, it's to be sure, Zuma has his own network of capitalists, and he's a crony, and he's all sort of bound up in what are apparently quite openly corrupt deals with some of these guys. But nevertheless, to see the labor movement and the Communist Party have exerted such gravity within the alliance has surprised and, as I say, humbled me. And that's the sort of thing that has, as I said, confounded many of us who thought that this was just a pure and simple neoliberal regime that Frantz Fanon would describe so well in Chapter 3 of The Wretched of the Earth: talk left and walk right and smash. And yes, that is still going on. But there are these very strange spaces, national health insurance, maybe a little bit on the trade policy. But the one that particularly reminds, with Leo's question, yes, and John's as well, no national industrial bourgeoisie. There is actually a move by labor to reestablish an industrial policy that would do the sorts of things I was describing. Again, it's because Rob Davies comes from a particular perspective, but there's also a new Minister of Economic Development that comes from labor, who's been talking to some of the firms, especially in textiles. His own background, Ibrahim Patel, was the textile trade union secretary, to actually rescue them under conditions where workers would be empowered or have more say. Hopefully, and Sam can help us on this, it won't be a GM or U.S. labor sellout on the auto front. But there are some prospects for those kind of industrial policy interventions, even if the national industrial bourgeoisie has flown and has relocated to London and elsewhere. To me, these would boil down to a more sophisticated strategy than we have had so far. We've had strategies. on the socialist independent left in South Africa that seem to work up to a point where the state will make concessions under conditions of protest, and we've been trying to stitch these together. I mentioned, for example, getting everyone who needs free AIDS medicines made locally, or getting free local water. And that's a little bit different than the organic strategies that are so beloved of autonomous, of just reconnecting illegally or importing the AIDS medicines illegally from Thailand or Brazil or India. And I think that probably is where I'd end, that this is one of the great challenges, as Andre Gortz distinguished between reformist reforms where you're going into these situations where you feel there's a little bit of an opening in the state, but the reforms that you're demanding will actually weaken you, because once a state has more legitimacy, once capital makes a little bit of a concession, maybe your movement loses its momentum and its anger and its militancy. Maybe the reform itself actually further commodifies what you're demanding and basically takes what your whole project of building grievances into proper demands, militant strategies and tactics, alliance building, and then you actually lose because you win. And that's the story of so many social movements, isn't it? And I think it's to what Gortz called a non-reformist reform, in which by demanding the more strategic approaches to water and AIDS medicines, we actually build a base from which momentum is built. The movements that have been active are actually empowered in the process, and the demands themselves are won in such a way that we see a sort of decommodification, de-stratification, de-globalization that actually are in principle with, in keeping with socialist principles. I always struggle to find those, and I'd love to maintain discussions, because I know in earlier epochs and in Canadian debates about the ways forward for the left, you're always approaching relations between your movements and the state with those kinds of sensitivities. What we see in South Africa, and what I think will probably amplify throughout the South, is rage and anger, and these 8,000 protests continuing at a very high pitch, and the possibility of a sort of alliance capture of these decreasingly effective. But whether these can be then channeled into socialist programs that do the non-reformist reform route, that take us into the state where we need to, bring us into courts, but not in a way that undermines the integrity of the mass base. Those are the big challenges, and in a couple of the cases, I think there's grounds for optimism, even if, as John will point out, we should be quite realistic about the balance of forces across the continent, and the lack of a proletariat, the lack of strong social movements, and the lack of even national patriotic bourgeois and political leaders. Those may come increasingly from approaches in which social movements and labor get together. And I hope this epoch we've had in South Africa since 1994, where some of us on the ultra-left had so quickly dismissed the possibilities of any of these changes meaning anything, is a thing of the past, where we admit we were wrong, and we're hoping that COSATU and some of the communists intensify their militancy. Maybe, once again, as in an earlier epoch, a revolutionary movement can threaten South African and wider capital.
Well, with Patrick making that unheard of optimism towards the ANC SACP government, we'll turn it over to
Okay. Just I'll begin with Ernie's point or question about Iran. I didn't mention Iran because I knew it's a huge topic, but just some reflections. I think firstly to see that the crisis in Iran is not about the elections. It's not just about the elections. It's something that runs a lot deeper. I think it is related in many ways to the economic crisis, that this is part one reflection of the economic crisis. Like I tried to say in the case of Kuwait, it had a certain reflection around the parliamentary struggles. I think clearly the Iranian people are suffering because of the decline in exports and the broader global crisis, and this is one way it is being reflected. I think it's very clear that the elections were rigged, and I'm saying this not in the sense of that we know what happened after the election, but I'm saying it was rigged from the get-go by the way that the actual election system is structured. I'm not making any comment on, I don't know, no one here knows what happened once the votes were cast, but the way that the election system is structured over there, the fact that 4 candidates, I think, out of 200 were permitted to run. I think that was the figure, and very clearly the whole system is rigged from the get-go. So that, I think, is, I don't think it's right to focus on, speculate over how the elections actually proceeded after the vote was count. I think the current demonstrations clearly indicate disputes among the Iranian bourgeoisie, and reflected through different position of different clerics. There doesn't seem to be a lot of difference in terms of support for neoliberal policies from both wings, if you like, the Mousawi and Ahmadinejad. They both essentially support many of the same policies. But it's clear also that the demonstrations show that there is a wider support or a wider... I don't agree with the way it's been characterized by some on the left as this is just like the rich university students versus the poor masses, that actually these demonstrations have been huge, and they clearly are drawing in people that are not just Twitter-obsessed university students. But beyond that, I think the kinds of things that we can be talking about here around supporting the democratic struggles, democratic rights, not just around the elections, but broader democratic rights in Iran, but always keeping in mind the question of being opposed to any kind of imperialist intervention in Iran, and using that as the point to distinguish between other, the support that Obama, even though it's been muted, might have shown, or other governments might have shown towards the demonstration. So I guess that's the initial, just some comments. On the question of in the possibilities of industrialization and state-led industrialization, I think I echo what Patrick is saying, that I think the space for a national bourgeoisie in this particular period, I think, is much less than it was back in the 30s or 60s, because of the internationalization of capital at a global level. That the successful bourgeoisies in the global south essentially integrated into the global financial system, maybe as maybe as minor partners, but they certainly have an interest in the way the system functions, and the Gulf is a very good example of that. Having said that, though, the importance of industrialization strategies, finding ways to meet the needs of populations in the global south, is more pronounced than ever before. The question is whether the bourgeoisies of these countries are the ones capable of carrying that out, or whether it has to be pushed by popular movements from below, as Patrick has described, in alliance with elements within the state. And I think the example here of Venezuela is a good example in the sense that Venezuela, and here I disagree with what Jordan had to say, in the case of Venezuela, the way that I read it is that the Chavez administration has been extremely clever in not just imposing a state-led industrialization from above, or doing this to help create space for a Venezuelan bourgeoisie, but actually look at ways of building and strengthening popular and social movements in the country itself. It's a contradictory process. It's not always successful, but I think the pretty consistent efforts that the Chavez or elements around Chavez, not the whole government, have played over the last few years in strengthening, trying to build socialist currents in the country, is a good example of what can be done, and a creative way of not seeing it as either one or the other, or above or below, or whatever the ways, but actually echoing the comments that Patrick was making, that these strategies have to find ways to intersect and play up the contradictions that exist within some of the states itself. And on the question of other struggles beyond class struggles in Egypt and broader civil society movements, I think I would say that in the case of Palestine, and perhaps in the case of Lebanon, where you do have some struggles that are building around resistance to imperialism, also trying to build some links with trade unions and worker struggles, and seeing some creative examples in both those cases. And again, the point that was raised earlier about the link between global solidarity movements and local struggles, the question of Palestine and the role of Palestinian civil society, for want of a better term, has been key in providing the link between the global solidarity movement as well as local struggles. So those two cases, Palestine and Lebanon. Other places such as Jordan, it's really, there has been nothing as far as I'm aware of. The question of Iraq is another, it's the crisis, the way it is unfolding in Iraq is very, again, despite what you see in the mainstream media, is a devastating crisis because of the high levels of unemployment and the crisis of state funding that Iraq actually faces because of the drop in the price of oil, which again, the Gulf money is going in and buying up Iraqi banks and trying to take advantage of this. But I do think in the case of Iraq that there are spaces and openings there that might be interesting in the future as this unfolds. But I'll leave it there, and thank you to Patrick for his comments as well.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Patrick and Adam, who are, of course, two of the leading socialist intellectuals on the financial crisis, but of course also some of the best examples of people engaged also with extensive political activities on the ground. Patrick, you can always find Patrick almost all over the web, but if you want to see what he's up to all the time, you can go through the Center for Civil Society and plug into his daily blog, which almost has all of the 8,000 actions in South Africa going on every day.
He writes too fast.
With Adam, he's of course been also writing prolifically, particularly around Palestinian issues, but also now on the Gulf. You can see what he's been up to partly in the bulletin at the back for Labor Solidarity with Palestine, Jaffa. I'd like to thank both of you for coming.